So Ben, thanks for letting me talk to you guys about some of the things I've been doing throughout the year this year. Just a quick intro for folks in the audience I haven't met yet. My name's Mike Piscopo. By day, I'm the director of a cybersecurity practice. Yes, I've been locked in a bank vault twice with the IT security director and a detective. And yes, we were doing signals work. But about 6 years ago, I hired a guy who was a pen tester, a young guy, and he comes on board. He's like, have you heard about these SDR things? All the cool hackers have them. We're all trying to break in this stuff. And I picked one up, and ever since then, I've been hooked. So yeah, over the last few years, it took me maybe a year or so to kind of get my feet under me. But along the way, I suddenly realized there was things I wanted to do that I couldn't do or that GNU Radio didn't have. And a lot of out-of-tree modules kind of fell out the other side of it. So if you guys recognize the go stop, that was my attempt to kind of be quiet, and that totally fell apart. But CorrectIQ, LFast, GRNet, CL-enabled are all some of the blocks that I put together. But my undergrad's aerospace engineering, and I spent my time doing the aerospace contracting thing, real-time distributed centrifuge work, IT, C++, embedded work, and eventually kind of moved into IT, and that's when I ended up in cyber. But along the ways, I never kind of got too far from my aerospace roots. So what that really meant was I can't seem to help but point my antennas towards things that fly or things that are in space. So when Ben said this year was all about a space-based theme, I'm like, hey, I think I got some projects I'm working on that might be of interest. So 2016, 2017 was really kind of a focus on trying to squeeze performance out of GNU Radio. 2018 was really kind of the year of the drone and comms links. But this year, I happened to pick up space themes early in the year. And so what I ended up putting together, there's nothing really like evolutionary or revolutionary that I did, but as I was working through some of these space-based projects, there was just a couple of gaps or things that I wanted to do a little bit easier. And so it kind of covered the gambit. There's a little bit of work with some low Earth orbit and polar orbiting kind of orbital mechanic solutions. There's a little bit, I always seem to have this fascination with trying to point things back at the moon, and I'm still trying to work on that. But there were some things along the lines of that I felt like we were missing. And then the last piece of it that kind of came up on a whim. I was sitting there on a Friday afternoon waiting for my teenagers to finish doing something, and I happened to scroll through the Twitter feed and saw Ben's post about the hackathon out at the Allen Telescope Array. And I'm like, I got to do this. And so Steve Croft, who's here, I think he's talking tomorrow, Andrew Simeon and Ben put together an absolutely fantastic event out at the Allen Telescope Array. I feel like we could have probably lived there for another week and had a blast. But I'll talk a little bit about some of what I did and how that worked its way back into some of the GNU Radio modules. So the first scenario I'll talk about, and hopefully there's no other aerospace guys in the room because you'll catch me on a semantic, but this really started earlier in the year with an ISS SSTV event. And I said, hey, I've got these antennas to doing some of the weather stuff. They've been sitting around. I haven't really done anything with them in a couple of years. Wouldn't it be fun to pull out these antennas and see if I could decode some of these SSTV signals? And for those of you that do a lot of this stuff on the side, bad things happen and lots of time gets spent when you have cool ideas like that. So, I pulled it out, and of course, all the usual things started to come back. Anytime you got these orbital periods, you've got the satellites can come and arrive at different angles. You've got different windows that they may be there. And quite frankly, and this sounds really silly, but my house got in the way. My house is exactly oriented sort of east-west. And so when you get these north-south passes, it'd do really great if I put the antenna out front on the south side, and then as soon as it went out the back side, my signal would get bad. Same thing if I tried to do it the other way. I'd chase it out the back, and then it would get bad when it went out the front. So, I started to act like a user at this point. I can put out my own requirements and say, hey, wouldn't this be really cool if I could have a couple of antennas out there and just, just like when you're watching your flow graph, it would just know that, hey, the signal out back is stronger. Let's use that one. And then, the other side of it was this, and for you guys that track these orbital satellites, you'll know there's sort of these like windows in the day, and you're either watching and listening, or it's gone, right? And so if you're doing this on a weekend, and you go, hey, yeah, there's another pass at 2 o'clock, so let's hold off going and running our errands. And I got to wait and get the satellite pass. And one thing you got to have with this stuff is a really understanding wife, and I do. She totally gets it, even though she rolls her eyes at me sometimes. But for me to say, all right, well, I'm not going to go. We're not going to go to the food store. We're going to wait, and you got to wait for the pass to happen, and it's going to be like a half hour. yeah, well, it's 10 more minutes for the pass, and then something went wrong, and you're there for an hour. So, you know, wouldn't it be really nice if I could set up my GNU Radio setup such that I can get some smarts and some intelligent recording on there, because things never work the first time out, right? So if I could record my IQ streams without having to fill up like 2 terabytes worth of disk, and then come back to it and analyze what went wrong for my next pass, yeah, that'd all be really helpful, right? So I kind of boiled this down to 2 problems. One was I really wanted to have some more intelligent recording in my GNU Radio capabilities, and then the other side of it was, what do I do with the split coverage? How do I get this complete pass when I know I have obstacles? And I know, Robin had some great pictures with trees. Yeah, anybody that does this at home, you know, it's not exactly the most optimal setup. So this was really the first part of it, sort of starting at the bottom and working my way up. And there's always been this out-of-tree module called file repeater, and it was really for me to kind of have a source block to control how some files got played back. But it sort of took on the life of the facility for some of this file stuff. And the first smart storage block kind of went like this, and you know, it's kind of all about the why. I wanted to be able to point it at a place on disk, say, here's your directory, here's a base file name that I want you to work off of. And you know, I probably give you a little bit of parameters. I like to have the frequency and maybe the sample right there, because I always forget to include that in my file. And I'm going to look at Ben, and he's probably going, SIGMF, right? But you know, and then to have some parameters around being able to control an accidental runaway process, right? If I wanted to say, hey, don't go any more than this on disk space usage, or hey, for whatever reason, don't record for more than 10 minutes. But the other important part of that was I wanted some kind of message-based control to say when to start the recording and when to stop the recording. And so that was sort of the foundation for this block, and you'll see how that kind of fills in with some of the orbital mechanics in the next piece. But as I got a little bit further downstream, I found I wanted to make some other choices and say, well, I want to be able to do it when this is true, but maybe also when this is true. So some and or kind of logic blocks natively kind of fell in. The 2 in the middle, the other thing I always felt like I was missing a little bit in GNU Radio was to incorporate the concept of time. So somebody on the mailing list had actually put it out while I was working on one of these blocks, and I just went ahead and made the other one up. But back to me being lazy. I want to go to bed when I go to bed. I don't want to have to get up and catch a satellite pass at 2 a.m., right? So it would be really cool if I could tell GNU Radio, hey, I want you to start recording at 2 a.m., record for 10 minutes, start recording at 4 a.m., go ahead and record for another 10 minutes, call them something completely different on disk, and when I wake up and I have time, I'll come back and look at the files, right? So the time of day module was one of my solutions for that. So you can set some when to start and how long to go for. The other piece was just a basic state timer to say, hey, I've got a 30-minute period. I want you to record for 10 minutes, go to sleep for the rest of the half hour, then record for another 10 minutes, then go to sleep for a half hour. And timestamp, as the smart block writes, it'll timestamp each of the files when it creates them. So you don't have to worry about overwriting. And you really got to have a nice stack up on your data stream. So this was my solution to help solve my intelligent storage piece, but it was only part of it. The other side was really how to deal with it in the context of these satellites. So whether you go back and we're looking at the ISS stream, or the reason why I ended up calling this polar orbiting was that the ISS stream wasn't always there, and it took me longer to figure this out than it did for their transmission. So I ended up kind of focusing on the NOAA satellites just because they were only a few megahertz off from what we were doing in the 2-meter band. But I looked at gpredict, and it'd been around for a while. It still worked in 3.7, but it had some gaps. The author had sort of mothballed it and stopped maintaining it. And as soon as I dropped the block on it, was great that it could kind of control this variable. But I tried to drop it into a GUI sync, and it crashed and said, hey, you can't control variables that are tied to GUI controls. And I'm like, ugh. So then you look at gpredict a little bit, and they added some new flags to the messages that came out that were really, really helpful. They now had AOS and LOS, acquisition of signal and loss of signal, that you could turn on. I said, hey, this is perfect, right? If I tie this with my smart recording block, when acquisition of signal comes up, start my recording. When loss of signal happens, turn off my recording. Perfect, right? But that wasn't quite the way the blocks worked. So after a little bit of deliberation, I forked it, which I don't normally do. But I did fork it and kind of take it over and update the block to handle the new messages that were coming out of gpredict. When the flow graphs ended, the thread that was listening in there didn't shut down quite right. And if it got a message it didn't understand, Like if you tried to point rock control at it or something like that, it would act flaky. So I fixed all that and kind of split out the variable control piece. I went to a message-based theme and said, well, we can still control our variables, but now this more generic paired of var. And I said, well, I might want to use this in something else, so it's not just space-based stuff, right? So that I can use in other places. And then kind of to complete the picture, I knew I was going to be doing some things where I might have a rotator in place and I was going to be doing some tracking. And I said, well, wouldn't it be cool if we had some ability to get rotator, azimuth, and elevation into our GNU Radio flow graphs, because maybe I want to make some decisions based on that. A great example might be that, this is, even though there might be something that's visible horizon to horizon, I've got trees over here and something over here, and this is really my swath where I can actually get a signal. So what if I can incorporate that into my smart recording? And so there's now a rotator block in there and a secondary azimuth and elevation block, so you can kind of start to work in some decisions. But that block just puts out a dictionary with an azimuth and elevation, and you can kind of work with it downstream. So at the end of the day, this was probably a little bit more complicated as an example, but this was what I was ultimately able to kind of get to from a decision-based process, right? I've got a satellite, it's orbiting, acquisition of signal comes up. I may or may not have some restrictions on my azimuth controls, and when those conditions are met, start my recording, and hey, I want to see what's going on. I'm going to output it to a message sync on screen. And this worked great. It actually did kind of help me solve some of my downstream problems. But I didn't have a lot of time to get a couple other slides in here, but there's a couple of other things just to mention in passing. If you work with maybe probes where there isn't necessarily an orbital mechanic, you can't get TLEs, just for whatever reason you can't get Doppler. There's a couple of other options that are kind of scattered in some of these blocks. The first one is in gpredict, there's a velocity-based one. So if you have a radial velocity and you know the frequency, it'll help feed back and do the Doppler shift corrections back into your flow graph. The last one was sort of a path of last resort, right? You have no Doppler point of reference. There's a block in GRMesa where you can tell it what frequency it should be at, and it'll watch the spectrum, and when it does see the signals, it'll shift it back to where it should be and do the Doppler correction for you. All this was sort of thinking ahead, and you'll see when I get into the moon-based stuff. This was all to support maybe some other future moon stuff or space stuff where we still, to this day, maybe don't have a point of reference. So split coverage. This was, if you look at these flow graphs, it's really easy to see. And this was like the machine learning side of things. If I can see it, how do I get GNU Radio to take care of this? And some of the pieces were just missing. So in GRMesa, there's a couple of new blocks. Not all of them that are in there I'm talking about, but it's a good block to kind of go and take a look at. But the first piece was that max power. There's always assumptions in how you do this, right? So if you're doing beamforming or radar, it's this whole far field, planar, narrow beam. You kind of know that they're there. For me, in this particular case, there was a bunch of assumptions. One, that I wasn't in a noisy spectrum, right? I'm not trying to do this in 2.4 gigahertz with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth all over the place. This was a dedicated band. The signal only came up in these bands when there was actually something there to be seen. So it was really easy. I could do a power-based approach. But I needed a way in GNU Radio to not only recognize that, but then make a decision to say, if I've got two remote antennas feeding me input streams, which one is the best signal? So just based on that basic power approach, there's now a source selector block. And again, this was kind of my way of saying I may want to use this for something else later, right? But it just takes these decision value messages coming inbound. And at whatever point, based on the state on the messages coming in, whichever one has the highest decision value is the one that outputs the index in, and that was my way to solve that problem. There was an I/O selector, and I don't know if anybody knows. I haven't looked actually to see if this one got deprecated. It was on the deprecated list for 3.7, and I didn't look to see if it was gone in 3.8 or not. But there's an I/O selector block that was, again, kind of a perfect fit, but it was missing a couple things. So I rolled that into Mesa, rewrote it in C++. I think the old one was in Python, and added some message-based control to it so that I can feed these blocks together and then get my stream input. So this was sort of the foundation to help me get these two signals coming in. And you can see all these flow graphs. I like posting these up so other people can kind of see it. But in the Mesa examples, these flow graphs that I use are up there. This is actually running at my house. It's a little bit messy, but you can see the transition from the one on the left down to the middle, the one on the right. And this was really the NOAA 19 coming up on the south side of my house, starting to get in the way, and then transitioning and switching over to the other side of it. And there's, I don't want to push any buttons because I'm afraid I'm going to mess something up, but some of the UI up top, you can see how the indexes get updated and actually watch it switch over. So this was, again, it's low res, I know, but it was close in the band, and that was what I ended up picking with. So I had a couple of great shots unexpectedly when Dorian came up the coast the other week. It was nice for me to be able to see it. I've got family that lives in South Carolina, and there was a whole lot of talk about what was going on down there. But yeah, this was one of the pictures that I got, and it's interesting that the two receivers I have, one on the north side, one on the south side, they're not coherent. So, but they do feed UDP streams with some of the blocks. I'll show you from the Allen telescope array, but that was sort of my test bed. You can see right in the middle, and it's funny, my wife looked at that and I said, that's the house, right? You can see in the line where the antennas start to switch over. The decoder loses the phase sync because they're not coherent, and then it just resyncs and switches over. But of course, my family's given it like interesting names. There's the black can in the front that's the circular antenna out front, and we were getting ready for a party, and I got the whole, can we move that gray thing on the back? So you can see it kind of transitions from the black, house in the way. But I got a more complete picture that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to get. If you can kind of tolerate like the DC spike, this quick phase shift over, it did help me kind of solve the problem with an obstruction and get this full picture. All right. So one project is never enough. The next thing I kind of got back to is, Marcus is laughing, you guys know. Yeah, I've always had this fascination with trying to get my dishes back at the moon, and I know they're not where I want them to be. So it's a project. But with NASA aligned with this whole return to the moon in 2024, I mean, we're going to end up on Mars. It's just going to happen, right? So we as an open source community, do we have the tools that we need to do to start really pointing our antennas and get the open source and GNU Radio community starting to look and use some of these future targets as well. And there's problems, right? I mean, the moon's really far away. I had the opportunity to go back to the Allen telescope array, and in front of a world-renowned astrophysicist, I said, I hate antennas. And I got this really mean look. And I hate antennas because whenever anything goes wrong, it's always because something got screwed up at the antenna. But they're really far away. You need to know where to look. And the moon's pretty easy. It's this really big target up in the sky. But you almost can't see it in that bottom picture. It says Mars with a little arrow. But if you're trying to think ahead for when we go to Mars and you want to try to point a dish at it, that's a really small target. If you guys have ever tried to do any hand tracking and you're messing with the laptop and you're trying to figure out why a flow graph's not working and hand track a moving target at the same time, it's just not going to work, right? So you got to have some automated control in this. And GPredict is fantastic. I mean, it really is the go-to for Earth orbiting satellites. Problem is, the TLE model that's used is really an orbital model that's designed for an Earth-centric orbital model. It just, it's not designed for anything outside Earth. You couldn't take it and apply the same thing and run GPredict Mars right now. The models are different. So that was a problem. It didn't help me out with any celestial body. So whether you want to point at the moon, Mars, Jupiter, any of that, GPredict just isn't going to help. And then sort of the last piece, well, I said, well, if I'm going to do this, what about radio astronomy? What if I got another set of coordinate systems and I got right ascension and declination? How can I get all this to work with what I want to do in GNU Radio, assuming my antenna is good enough? And so that bore out what I ended up posting out as something called SkyTrack. So there's a great new module called Skyfield. I love C++ for performance. I love Python because I can get a lot done quickly, and if I don't need performance, it's a great go-to. So I found the Skyfield module that was out there that really easily had all the information I needed for solar system objects, including the moon. So I wrapped it up with a nice Python. There's a number of parameters you can set in there, but if you tell it what you want to look at, you give it your lat and long where you are. You can point it at your rotator. There's even a frequency option if you care about lunar Doppler shift. There's an option to feed that stuff out. The nice thing about it is that I made it match what we're already expecting. So if you look at what GPredict puts out for its antenna control and its radio control, this looks exactly downstream just like those do. So if you have a rotator hooked up to rock control, the hamlib library, or you're using any of the blocks in GNU Radio, and you point this at it, it's not going to know the difference. So this was one of the examples. You can kind of see I did some integration. The antenna I was using was a little bit too small to really pick up the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter's telemetry in the 2.2 range, but just that's an offset tune. That's not a DC spike. But it's an offset tune shot that I was able to integrate out and use this to track the moon while I was doing it. If you guys are in the workshop this afternoon, you'll see, I'll talk a little bit about that azimuth offset too, this is like the college professor question of if you go outside with your dish and you grab your compass and you point it at something and why you're totally not going to get the signal. That's the trick question, but I'll talk about that this afternoon. So this was the other side of pointing, and anybody that goes back to your statics and dynamics in your early college careers, like all that stuff you hated about multiple rotating coordinate systems, this all applies when you get into some of the space-based stuff and radio astronomy. And so the fixed coordinate system is the celestial coordinate system, and you'll see things like right ascension and declination. They become what sort of look like latitude and longitude, but it's focused on the celestial sphere. It was their attempt to find sort of an unmoving coordinate system so that no matter where you are, you could specify where something was in the sky. So 0 is this vernal equinox crossing at a particular time of the year, in a particular year. But the problem with trying to get your dishes pointed upward towards this kind of stuff is that it's not only location dependent, but it's also date and time dependent. So if you think about as the Earth is going around the sun and it's rotating at the same time, there's 2 more degrees of freedom, and somehow you got to reference something up in the sky and say it's over there and get your local azimuth and elevation pointed in the right direction. It was a completely different problem than the SkyTrack piece, just because that library didn't support that. But there's another tool that's in that same set called Radical. Seemed like a cool name. But it's in that SkyTrack repo. It uses a different set of calls from the AstroPi library, but it does exactly the same thing. It looks downstream to GNU Radio and to the rock control stuff, just like gpredict does. So if you're doing any radio astronomy and you have your target that's a right ascension declination, you can set up that with the command line parameters, point it at your rotator, and have it go ahead and do the tracking as accurate as you got your antenna set up to do. So the last one I'll talk about, this was really exciting. I think anybody that's been there has probably got a great smile on their face. Steve Croft did a fantastic job getting, I think there were 34 of us there. They were joking that there was more of us at the array than the population of the nearby town. But Steve managed to keep all of us fed and keep all the activities going. But we really had unprecedented access to, they have 42 dishes, 42 6-meter dishes there. Each dish has a horizontal and a vertical polarization. There's a log periodic feed in there that covers 500 megahertz to 10 gigahertz. It's cryo-cooled to get the system noise down really, really low. For each of the polarizations, there's over 104 megahertz of bandwidth coming out of this. And it's not just that you could use them as a single antenna, but obviously the benefit of the array is that they've got a beamformer set up that can correlate these guys and get the whole antenna array in play. And the beamformer would output just over 1.6 gigs a second of jumbo UDP packets. Yes? Or did you have a question? Oh, okay, thanks. Of jumbo UDP packets for each of the polarizations. So it was a lot of data. There's a 40 gig backplane in the core, 10 gigabit per second distribution at the systems that were doing the recording and moving the data around. And then there was another intermediate zone. So we had a number of groups that were working on there. Ben headed up some more great work on the SIG-MF. Derek and I were working on some of the beamformer stream ingestion stuff and trying to control the array from GNU Radio. Folks were tapping in the new usurps directly into the antenna feed. Nick was working on trying to pick up Voyager 2. We had some folks working on some of the 3.8 out of tree modules, and that's just some of them. I think there's probably just as many I'm forgetting, but there's a lot of great work over 3 days. I think everybody would probably say, I wish I had 2 more. But out the other side of that, what I was working on was trying to get that 3 gigs a second UDP data out of the beamformer and into GNU Radio. And so with the GRnet blocks, there's already UDP sources and sinks and TCP ones there. But we were really running into problems. For whatever reason, it just wasn't working right. And there were some headers in the way the data was coming out of the beamformer that we weren't quite set up to ingest. And nothing seemed to be kind of working with it while we were there on site. So by the end of day 3, I did what any good IT guy would do. I punted and I pulled out TCP dump because it was just UDP. And I said, all right, well, I'll just take this back to the lab. And I recorded a whole bunch of UDP packets coming out of there, and I was going to try to replay it back. So the first new block that came out of that was right after I got back, I needed a way to get those UDP packets to look like they came out of the antenna back into my flow graphs. So in GRnet, there's now a UDP PCAP source block where you can tell it what UDP port you want to watch, and as it gets the streams, give it the file and the UDP port, and it'll read the file back and pull it back in and even try to keep the schedule intact in terms of packet timing, but feed that back into your flow graph as a source just as if it came off the wire. So that was my first fix. Now I could work with the data. For anybody that was there, and I know a couple people cursed, the spectrums were inverted. So we had to recognize, why doesn't this look right? There's now an easy block to fix that in correct IQ. But GRnet really got a refactoring to really support this high-speed throughput on there. There's a couple other things too, and if anybody wants to catch me in between, I can talk to you about it. I had to write some other blocks to do the data conversion coming off the wire, because like the iCare blocks, there's a note in the GNU Radio source that says, hey, this may clip, and it actually was. So I had to go put some blocks together that would convert it so that it looks just like if you take the output of a HackRF or an RTL SDR and need to convert that to float complex, this does the same thing. So there's a lot of good blocks that came out of that. This was sort of the prove all. I ended up having the opportunity to go back in July and do some more retesting on this. And this was the final block. We actually were able to get the 2 feeds, UDP, coming out of the beamformer and write it out to file. And we got very, very, very little packet loss. And of course, any packet loss to me was kind of a little disturbing. But John Richards there said it was just very spurious. And he said, that's fantastic. It looks as good as what they had. So this all worked. But the benefit to that is now that all those GRnet UDP blocks and such have now all been updated and refactored to support that, which the UDP blocks in 3.8 were deprecated. They are gone. So if you need UDP blocks, go to GRnet. So I think that's it. I think I might have done it. Yeah, if you need any of these blocks, everything that's in that I talked about here, I did manage to jam out in the last 2 weeks getting everything converted over to 3.8. So these blocks are mate 3.7 and 3.8, and Tim was nice enough to do the pool. They are all in PyBombs as 3.8 too, so if you need them. But yeah, I generally kind of keep an eye on the mailing list, and I float around the Slack channel here and there. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you very much, Mike.